This is week 2, part 3. We just started talking about formal assessment, what it is, and some examples you might be able to think of from your experience. There are many concerns about formal assessments that you are probably aware of. A couple to highlight are test abuse, for example, basing instructional decisions strictly from formal assessments. Again, that's just one type of measure, and as the IRA standards for assessment indicate, we should be using more than one measure, getting multiple perspectives. There are many reasons why just using a standardized or formal assessment could not provide the most valid or reliable results. Follow-up informal assessments should definitely be given. Another concern of formal assessments are the gross simplification of the reading process. For example, they treat it as aggregates of isolated skills versus the holistic process, because it's really hard to assess the holistic process in a standardized setting on such a formal assessment. There's also poor generalizability because of the fact that the tasks are not authentic. And then, do they provide multiple opportunities for the reader? They also don't provide many different formats either. Test fairness. Typically, formal assessments have been found to be culture bound, and there's a presence of bias in the test content. So, those are some of the biggest concerns with formal assessments. There are definitely others that I am eager to hear about in your post on our discussion forum this week. Characteristics to consider when selecting or relying on results from a standardized assessment include looking at the title of the assessment, who the author is, the publisher, the date of publication, the level of difficulty, and how it is being administered. Is it whole group, small group, individually, that kind of thing. You should consider all of those. More characteristics. So typically a formal assessment can either be criterion referenced or norm referenced. When it is criterion referenced, it is based on how the student performed on the standards themselves, so how well they've learned a specific body of knowledge. When it's norm referenced, it's based off of the individual standing in comparison to their peer group. Standardized means simply that all students perform the same tasks under the same conditions, which should hopefully increase the generalizability if everyone's getting the same conditions. But unfortunately, not everyone may need the same conditions. They may actually need accommodations. Some stats terms to know when we talk about formal assessments include the mean, which is the average of the scores or the central value. The standard deviation, which is a unit of measurement that describes the distance from the mean or the distance from the measure of central tendency. So if you have a large standard deviation, that means there's a large spread from the mean versus having scores clustered around the mean or average score. So a large spread may indicate you have a lot, or a large standard deviation indicates that you have a lot of different needs happening in your class and a lot of different levels of performance. Correlation coefficient is the degree of association between two or more scores. It's usually reported in a scale from -1 to 1, where when you are closer to a +1, it implies that a high score on one aspect is related to a high score on another, whereas a score closer to -1 means that a high score on one implies a low score on the other, so an inverse relationship between the two variables or factors. And then if the correlation coefficient is 0 or very close to 0, it means there's no relationship or association between the two different variables or factors. So there's some stats for you. Validity is the appropriateness, usefulness, and meaningfulness of inferences made from test scores. So when you give an assessment and you're analyzing the results and looking at those test scores, how appropriate is it for you to place a lot of value and importance on those test scores? There's different types of validity. The first one I will address is content validity, and it deals with the content of the actual test, the questions, the formatting, the wording, the content, sampling. Criterion validity involves whether or not test results are comparable to other tests or if they can predict performance on future tests or measures, how predictive they are. So if you have two assessments that supposedly measure fluency, are the results on one comparable to the results on the other? Construct validity is when the measure tests what it is intended to measure. And consequential validity is the indirect consequences of using the assessment. For example, teaching to the test, which limits the content being delivered. If we're just teaching to the test, that would be something affecting the consequence of using the assessment. We'll do some scenarios in a second so you can get more familiar with these terms. Reliability is actually the consistency or the stability of the test scores. So the amount of random error apparent. So a lot of times they talk about inter-rater reliability, and is the score going to be consistent independent of the person who administered that assessment? So if it has high inter-rater reliability, it means that whoever gave the assessment, the student had a similar performance. So those results are pretty consistent, pretty stable, regardless of the test administrator. So thinking about, were there distractions that may impact the stability of the score? Is the student fatigued, tired, or not trying? If the same test is administered twice, will it yield the same test results? So that's also called test-retest reliability. So alternate forms or equivalence reliability is whether or not two forms of the test will yield the same results. So maybe a different ordering of questions or slightly different form or question type. So a quick analogy. So if you look at the bullseye for number 1, it has good reliability but poor validity. So it's not valid because it's not close to the target of where you're trying to hit, but they're all clustered, so it's reliable. The scores are consistent. Whereas number 2 has poor reliability but good validity on average. And then the last one has good reliability and good validity. So it's on the mark, but it's also reliable because you're consistently getting a similar result. So let's do a little practice. An assessment requires students to read words in isolation, and you are using it to infer reading ability. Is this a threat to reliability or validity? Let you think about that for a second. So this is a threat to validity, and the specific type of validity would be construct validity or criterion validity. Construct validity because the test is purporting to measure reading ability, but it's actually just looking at words in isolation. Number 2, during your session, the student's parent is sitting in and giving feedback to the child after each question. Is this a threat to reliability or validity? This would actually be a threat to reliability because chances are if you took that parent out of the room, the child may or may not perform similarly to how they did with the parent there. Last scenario, you are giving a student a comprehension assessment which features two literal comprehension questions. Is this a threat to validity or reliability? This would be a threat to validity because you could argue that it goes against, and you could argue that it goes against all types of validity too. Content validity because two questions isn't really a large enough sampling size. Construct validity because literal questions don't encompass all of the hierarchy of comprehension questions and types. So that was a little bit of practice. Why are we doing this now? Well, because as you start to give these assessments, you're going to be focused on your focus area for your evaluating assessment group. And for that group, you want to think critically about the validity of the assessment and if it is reliable, if scores will be consistent across different raters or across many different administrations of the same assessment, because you're going to report out to the class on limitations and strengths of the different assessments that can be used within your domain or focus area of reading. So we'll talk more about that right before we start working with students so that you have a better idea of what's going to be required of you for the presentation, but a big piece of that is looking critically at assessments. All right, let's talk about score reports. There's many different ways to report scores. First, percentiles. This is expressed in terms of percentage of persons scoring below a given raw score. So if you're in the 99th percentile, that means you are scoring higher than 99% of the population who took the assessment. Standard scores would be a deviation IQ or a STAY-9 where you're getting a score 1 through 9. Grade and age equivalent scores based on the average scores for students in each of a series of grades expressed in years and months. So usually it's either in a decimal like 1 dot, dot 6 or 1:6, which would either it usually stands for, first grade, 6 months into first grade, but it could also be an age equivalent. You probably wouldn't see 1.6 or 1:6, but it might be, 6:6 for 6 years and 6 months. One thing to think about when you begin work with your student is requesting if there are any standardized testing score reports maybe you could take a look at to give you kind of an idea of where they're performing or any formal assessments that you could report on. That would almost be like your screening measure or one of your screening measures that you're using. So something to think about when you plan for that assessment, maybe getting your hands on, if parents are okay with it, some of their formal test scores so you can take a look at the reports and what they look like. In your text, pages 463 to 499 have many examples of formal assessments. Honestly, a lot of them I was not familiar with and don't ever really use. The Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is one that's often cited a lot in research and used in research, and the Woodcock Reading Measure I'd heard of, but a lot of these are new to me. But they definitely discuss how they could be used for screening and or for diagnostics. I know our school psychologist does use a few of these for determining placement in special education, but aside from that, the formal test I use mostly, or that I've seen mostly, is the state test and then any English language screeners or anything like that. All right, that wraps up standard and formal testing. Next, we want to move on to Common Core pages 1 through 15 or 5 through 15, that brief overview. So I'm going to pause it here and we will finish up talking about that and RTI and call it a week.